Hello, and welcome to Raising the Bar with the MBBA. I'm your co-host, Adeola Adejobi.
And I'm Jason Clark, president of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association. The MBBA is the largest association of predominantly African American attorneys in New York. Our goal is to advance equality in the pursuit of justice, assist in the professional development of our members, and address legal issues affecting New Yorkers.
The goal of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a substantive conversation about justice issues in our community and to try to identify a couple of solutions in the process.
Today, we're going to discuss the future of civilian oversight. Joining us now is Jerika Richardson, Senior Advisor of the New York City Civilian Complaint and Review Board, as well as Jonathan Darche, Executive Director of the New York City Civilian Complaint and Review Board. Great. Well, thank you very much, Jerika and Jonathan, for joining us today. We're really excited to talk a little bit more about the future of civilian oversight. So both of you are with the Civilian Complaint and Review Board. Can you tell us a little bit about the CCRB and how, for example, someone may be able to file a complaint if it's necessary? Jerika?
Sure. Thank you so much for having us. The Civilian Complaint Review Board is the nation's largest independent police oversight entity. We were established in 1993, and part of the reason we came to fruition was because the public just really wanted to have an independent body overseeing interactions that they were having with law enforcement. And it was established under the city's first African-American mayor, Mayor David Dinkins. And over the course of the time, the CCRB has evolved. We investigate, mediate, and prosecute complaints of police misconduct. Our jurisdiction is based on or focused on force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, and offensive language. We have over 200 employees, and we receive about 5,000 cases a year.
Yeah, and I should even just mention on a note, the CCRB and the MBBA has actually worked together on a lot of different programs, making sure we're going out into communities and making sure people know their rights and people know exactly how they can file a complaint if they feel like they've been the victim, especially of some type of force incidents with a police officer.
We're very appreciative of the MBBA's help because if people don't know that the CCRB exists, then they can't file complaints with us. And doing outreach is not only a charter mandate for us, but it's so important so that people know that we are a resource available for them, and that we are a viable option for them when they feel they've been mistreated by police.
Right.
And can you talk about that process of now that people kind of know who you are and they want to file a complaint? Like, what does the process look like? What do they do?
So you can file complaints a number of ways. You could come down to our office at 100 Church Street and just walk in between 9 and 5 Monday through Friday. You could file a complaint online. Just Google CCRB NYC and there's an online form. You could call 311. You could call our hotline. Jerika, do you remember our hotline number?
I do. It's 1-800-341-CCRB.
Or you could drop something in the mail to us. These are all ways you can file complaints with us. Once you file a complaint, the case is assigned to an investigator. The investigator will take a statement from you. We'll find other civilian witnesses to take statements from. We'll request police paperwork. We'll go out to the scene and see if we can get surveillance video. We will request police documents. We'll request body-worn camera footage, other surveillance footage that the police may have, and then medical records. And then once we've assembled all of that information, we'll interview the police officers involved. And finally, once we've assembled all of that information, we marshal it, present it to the board, and the board votes and decides whether to substantiate the misconduct or not. If they substantiate misconduct, they then recommend discipline.
Yeah, and when you say discipline, like what types of discipline?
Broadly speaking, there are 3 types of discipline. It could be training. The medium form of discipline is a command discipline where it could result in between a reprimand and forfeiture of 10 vacation days. And the most serious form of discipline is charges and specifications. The penalty that is associated with charges and specifications can range from a reprimand to being terminated from the department.
So I think as you were mentioning, the CCRB got started under Mayor Dinkins, and I think it's been 25 years?
25 plus.
25 plus
Yes.
years since it's been around. So what are, so especially for some of our viewers who may not be familiar with some of the work of the CCRB. What would you say are some of the maybe more prominent occurrences that people may know some of the work that's been done through that?
Well, in addition to the jurisdiction that I laid out before, under our abuse of authority category in 2018, the board moved forward and actually passed a resolution to take on sexual misconduct. So that's something that's unique, that's happening here in New York. That is not something that a lot of other jurisdictions have taken on just yet, but we're really at the forefront of that. So we take on sexual misconduct. We accept sexual misconduct complaints right now, and part of that came from hearing from advocates and members of the community that felt uncomfortable really reporting directly to the police department an interaction of that nature that happened between an officer and a civilian. And part of our work is really listening to the community and answering the call and taking on issues that they think are important. In addition to sexual misconduct, we recently this summer served as the independent prosecutors in the case against Officer Daniel Pantaleo, who was involved in the death of Eric Garner. And in August of this year, Daniel Pantaleo was fired or terminated from the police department. And I really credit the work of our prosecutors in that. And I think, as the only body in the nation that actually has an administrative prosecution unit, I think we really are leading the charge in this way. And we are demonstrating that we are an additional resource for civilians who have an interaction with law enforcement. Obviously, there's the criminal route and there's the civil route, but you also have an administrative route. And so why it's important to file complaints with the CCRB is because it gives us an accurate read of what's happening on the ground in New York City. And it's another way to make sure that there's accountability happening in the department. An allegation that's substantiated against an officer will impact his or her standing within the department, and as John said, could lead to termination. So if you're interested in making sure that there's a healthy culture of accountability in the city, also lodging your complaints with the Civilian Complaint Review Board is another way to put a check on that. And then one other thing that happened this year, most recently, was on the ballot there were several charter revision proposals that were related to CCRB, and a number of, and they all passed. And John, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about those proposals, but I think it's positive for the agency itself.
So there were 5, in the way the charter reform worked is they grouped related things together for propositions. So there were 5 proposals that were all voted on as a bucket for the Civilian Complaint Review Board. The first proposal linked our budget to the NYPD's budget. And I think that's important because civilian oversight should be considered part of public safety. It shouldn't be an afterthought, because unless public safety is achieved in a fair way, it's not actually achieving public safety. Some of the other of the 5, we added to our jurisdiction false official statements made to the agency in the course of an investigation. And that is something that we had been hearing for many years from advocates that they were interested in, and it will have a real impact. Currently, when the board finds evidence that a member of service has made a false official statement, we refer that to the Internal Affairs Division for them to investigate. And starting in March, we will begin investigating those as allegations that we will then, if they are substantiated and the board recommends the most serious form of discipline, the Administrative Prosecution Unit will bring those charges in the trial room at 1PP. The charter now also requires the police commissioner to give us more information in cases where the police department deviates from the discipline that we recommend. The charter also allowed the board to designate the ability to sign subpoenas, which seems like a kind of minor thing, But it's very important because so much of what we do involves going out to the scene and getting video footage, surveillance video footage, from places that may record over their video footage.
Yeah, subpoena power is very important, yeah.
Which we've always had, but not being able, like right now our process is the investigator prepares a subpoena, it's sent uptown to where our chair is working his day job, he signs them, then they come back down, and then you serve the subpoena. And sometimes a location may record over the media in like 3 days. So, if the chair, who, although he is diligent, is away for the weekend, you put something on a Friday and he doesn't sign it till Monday, you don't get it till a Tuesday, the footage may be gone. Okay. So having the ability for me or other executive staff to get that subpoena signed is actually quite important.
Yeah, and when you're talking about like reviewing surveillance materials, can you talk a little bit more also about like nationally how different agencies are dealing with body cameras in terms of like transparency in the process?
I think actually New York has recently made big strides in how we're going to do that. We just signed an agreement with the police department on how we're going to review footage. So there is no national standard. Across jurisdictions, there's wide variation. San Francisco and Washington, D.C. have very robust systems where the civilian oversight entities can view body-worn camera footage. Chicago also has a very public, where it's not just the oversight agencies, but other entities can view body-worn camera footage easily. What we've now done with our memorandum of understanding is a huge leap forward for us to have direct access, to see unredacted footage and then have quick access to it, confident that we're getting all of the footage, and having a process that still protects the privacy of civilians and members of service alike. So it's body-worn camera footage, I think, could revolutionize civilian oversight. I know there are some people who feel, because there are so many well-known instances of officers committing misconduct on camera and then not being disciplined, that what is the point? But what we've seen is a real change in our ability to reach determinations on the merits in cases where we have body-worn camera footage. And I think it's really going to impact how we can do our jobs better for the people of this city.
And I think the audio component of body-worn cameras is also important. It's actually impacted our cases, and we're seeing increasing numbers of cases involving discourtesy or offensive language being substantiated because you have that audio capturing that. Whereas if you just had surveillance footage from a store or outside, you wouldn't have that audio. So I think it's really impacting the work we're doing dramatically.
One of the things with body-worn camera footage is the way the technology works. You really need to have skilled investigators and software, fairly sophisticated software to evaluate it. Because it may be that something looks much different when you're just viewing the footage. If you don't use the right technology to view it, the reality of what is contained in the data is actually very different than when you're just viewing it in like your regular browser.
I mean, I think for a lot of folks, after the death of Eric Garner, and people were able to see some of the actual footage of what it was, because not police officers, but just individuals were videotaping it. And then when the officer involved, the case against him didn't move past the grand jury, I mean, people felt, helpless. What are people able to do to kind of protect themselves? And I think that's why this conversation about civilian oversight is important. And certainly it's because of the CCRB that, I recognize there are probably a lot of folks who maybe wanted something more severe as a result as to what happened with Eric Garner, but at least because there was a complaint that was lodged, we were able to make sure that there were some type of ramifications for Mr. Pantaleo. But I guess that's my long way of actually getting into this larger question about civilians. I mean, I think a lot of times people have questions about, if they lodge a complaint, when are they going to be able to see an answer and how long it takes. I guess why, for example, does it take a certain amount of time for people to be able to get a response or get a resolution after they've filed a complaint with the CCRB, for example?
Investigations, I think we work really hard to make sure that they're very thorough. There are a lot of moving parts to these investigations where we are not only interviewing the civilian or other witnesses involved, we're also interviewing the officer. And I think there is an emphasis on making sure that we leave no stone unturned, that we get all the information that we can. I think body-worn camera footage will be helpful in that. I think it's helping us really determine what actually happened in any given situation. So it's added evidence, but the process can be lengthy and can be long. But that's something that we are working on every day to make sure that we are keeping in touch with civilians throughout the process. That's part of the reason we established an outreach and intergovernmental affairs unit. We have folks that are going out in the community, letting people know about the process. So on the front end, they know that it's important that you can't just lodge a complaint. It's important to stay in the process because we're going to need that sworn statement from you in order to go forward. I think some of the challenges are that members of the community want to pick up the phone, tell you about an incident that happened, and just stop there. In order for us really to get a sense of what happened and come to a more definitive conclusion, we do need to talk to people involved, and we do encourage the public how important it is to stay in the process and go forward with the complaint. But we know there are a lot of things in life that come up and challenges that make it hard, whether it's work or things that are happening at home. And so we've been working to make sure that our investigators are accessible. So in addition to some of the ways that you can file a complaint that we talked about before, during the process, we will also make investigators available to come meet you in a neutral location or go to a city council member's office that may be participating in our community partners initiative. So we want to make sure that we make the process as easy as possible for civilians. And if they stick with us, we will make sure that it gets done.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about what the investigation timeline looks like, just so people have an idea and they know what to expect when they're filing a claim with you all?
Full investigations in which at least one allegation has been substantiated are running approximately 7 months to completion, right, from the complaint being received until the board making a determination. In cases where the board has substantiated a case and is recommending charges, the administrative prosecution process could last as much as another 1.5 years, 2 years after that.
Okay. And then are you noticing any national trends around how communities are feeling about transparency as opposed to officer privacy?
So one of the things that a large debate that's been happening here in New York is related to Civil Rights Law 50A.
Could you explain for folks who don't know what Civil Rights Law 50A is?
It makes all personnel records for police officers, firefighters, and correction officers in New York City secret, essentially. So because our records could lead to disciplinary action being taken against a police officer, we cannot reveal them to the public.
Right, and I just also want to point out, I believe part of the conversation is the fact that even though that law has been on the books for a long time, it actually hadn't been enforced for a long time. And I think they just started forcing it, kind of around the time where we were dealing with the Eric Garner matter in 2014.
The CCRB has been fairly consistent in following 50A. There were changes made to how the police department was treating certain information that was being given to reporters. But the department had also not given out much of this information prior to that change in how they were interpreting it with regard to reporters.
So 48 other states in the country are a lot more liberal with the information that they give out involving officer discipline. New York, probably under 50A, has one of the strictest laws. For example, if you look at Chicago, they actually make that data accessible online, and that's something that we're not doing here. And I think it's the reason why we're hearing a lot from not only journalists, but we're hearing members of the community, from the members of the community, that while they may lodge a complaint or they may see something covered in the news about an incident that happened, they don't always find out what was the final result. Obviously, we will know because we were part of the process, and the department will know, but that information, because of 50A, is just not readily available to folks. And so there has been a debate, and there's been a move for more transparency in New York. I think there are some bills targeted towards reform, and there are some targeted towards repeal. The chair of the Civilian Complaint Review Board has spoken out in his personal capacity and said that he is in favor of repeal. And so that's a conversation that we will be continuing to have over the coming months, where the board will be taking, I think, a public position on this issue. But I think when you think about the Civilian Complaint Review Board and you think about police oversight and accountability across the nation, I think the public really wants for there to be more transparency and for there to be more information about what's happening in our communities and how officers are being disciplined.
So one of the things that we take into account when we're making determinations of whether misconduct occurred is what the law and the patrol guide permit officers to do. So there may be cases where a person feels they were treated poorly, and when we examine the case, we determine that that conduct occurred, but that under the law and the patrol guide, it was permitted. And so we will exonerate that conduct. And if you're a civilian sitting at home and you open up a letter and you just read that, you may feel like we're saying that it didn't happen. When in fact, we're saying we believe you, this happened, but then we can't explain to them why it was allowed and permitted. And it hurts our credibility with the public when we can't explain why we do things.
Right.
Right, and at least, as we're talking about some of the reforms that just came to the city charter and the idea that the CRB will be able to investigate claims of false statements, or rather just false statements that were made by law enforcement, I like to think that that probably plays a big role in being able to redevelop or reestablish that trust. Because when we're talking about oversight and we're talking about especially folks, law enforcement, the main thing that I hear all the time is that someone feels like they had been the victim of a police misconduct, but no one's going to do anything about it, or no one is willing to hear what's going on. Or when the complaint is lodged, then if the officers just say they didn't do it, there's no way to be able to really counter that. So that's why I certainly think the body cameras help, and certainly making sure that there is some type of punishment for folks who do give false statements. But I guess generally when we're talking about it from even outside of New York, like, what are some of the things that we should be doing, or looking even to our federal government when we're seeing some of these police misconduct actions happening in other states? Like, what are the things that we would like to see also be out there?
Oh, I think in general, I think the message that we should take away from all of this is, yes, it was great that there was this administrative process, but I think really the responsibility of accountability rests on all of us. The state should be looking at it. Your local cities and your local municipalities should be looking at it, but we should also have the federal government involved in it, because there are different tiers and there are different avenues for justice. And fortunately for the Garner family, there was this additional avenue for them here in New York City. And what we're finding is, because of the work that we've been doing, but also just the focus on this issue, we've had folks coming from all across the country, from other jurisdictions, coming to New York to learn more about our process so they could replicate it elsewhere. But we've also recognized that police accountability is not just a U.S. issue. It's something that folks are grappling with outside of the U.S. We've hosted law enforcement officials from Italy, from Ethiopia, from Ireland, from Mexico, all who have a vested interest in trying to increase the public trust. And I really believe that folks are thinking about accountability in a different way and understanding that you can change training in a department, but if the public does not feel that there are consequences and repercussions for officers that engage in misconduct, that bond, that trust is just not going to be there.
The new president of NACOL, the National Association for the Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, Susan Hudson, she's the independent monitor down in New Orleans. And she's trying to build on what NACOL has done already to make this more of a national issue and to increase its prominence and make it so that there are national standards for civilian oversight. And she's working very hard on that as the past president of NACOL, Brian Corr, and people all over the country.
Yeah, and we only have a few minutes left, but we would love to hear from you about what are some of the other national solutions that people are coming up with, or maybe even your office.
So I think one of the things that John just touched upon when he mentioned the head of NACOL is that there are different versions of oversight. So we have monitors, we also have inspector generals, and we have these investigative bodies like the Civilian Complaint Review Board. I think one thing that we've seen here in New York is that we have all three of those things happening at the same time. And we're actually able to collaborate with each other. We're able to share information so that we're not just focusing on investigating one particular case, but we're also looking at policies and trends that are happening in the department so that we can also advocate to elected officials, to communities, to policymakers, really to put forth things that are going to tackle police accountability from a broad perspective and not just on a case-by-case basis.
If you look at the Floyd litigation that led to the changes in stop and frisk policy here in New York City, a lot of the findings that Judge Shindlin made in that case were based on CCRB data. And she would not have been able to make that ruling without the cases that the CCRB had investigated and the CCRB had decided misconduct had occurred.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for that quality information. I'm sure that people had no idea about you all, and now they do. And so thank you so much for watching Raising the Bar with the MBBA on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. See you next time.
Goodbye.